Hello, everyone, and happy Tuesday, which I like to call second Monday, given that there's the first Monday we have at home and then the second Monday we get to experience here each week. So this afternoon, we are going to get the first in a series of updates on school budgets as we sort of work our way towards building the yield bill. And then we're going to, somewhat related, hear from Julia Richter and Pat Titterton from JFO about a report that they just completed on the costs of the Universal School Meals Program and revenue sources. And then we are going to hear from Commissioner Bolio on H 153, that bill sponsored, which is the governor's tax asks for the year. And then really for the rest of the week, we're going to be diving in kind of deep to work through sort of this two technical type bills that we picked up last week. Anything I missed other than huge congratulations to Representative Mattis? Welcome. Would you like to join us? Pat, it is such a pleasure to have you in the committee. I think it's your first time.
As I was saying, it's the wrong view.
Sorry. We are in the penthouse now, though.
Oh, well, that's true.
Yes.
I was exhausted walking out.
I'm so sorry. Sorry.
Take the elevator next time. So, Brad James, Agency of Education. I am the Director of Finance, for those of you who don't know me.
At the Agency of Education?
At the Agency of Education, as far as I know still. They haven't gotten rid of me yet. And I am here to give you a preview of what I know about preliminary budgets for this upcoming school year. So, if just kind of as quick background, you're all familiar with the December 1 letter from the tax commissioner. What we do, what sits behind that is a lot of work that I do with the school districts at the time, kind of making estimates as to what they think they're going to be spending for the coming school year. This is before they're starting their budget process, but this is before they're really into it and finalizing their budgets. And so one of the big drivers in the education fund is education spending. That's that big line of 1.5 or $6 billion, whatever it happens to be this year. And that the one for FY24 is an estimate that I made based on what the business managers were telling me about their school districts. And when I did that, it came in about 8.52% higher than what it had been in the previous year, based on what they were saying, when it finally came in. So that's kind of where we started this. So that's what's happened in the December 1 letter. And so now I have asked business managers to send me in what their school board approved budgets are. I've heard from roughly 20% of them.
20% of districts or 20% of representing 20% of students?
Districts, so the budgets. So they're about 100, if somewhere there we've got a couple of GORs and unorganized towns, but they're about 115, 117 school districts that we're expecting budgets from. And I've gotten about 20% of them. I have 24 is how many have reported to me. And so I assume everybody has pulled this up in front of them. So basically, I guess I think I'll just go through the yellow section. And the reason it's yellow is because when I'm opening this file, it tells me what I froze and what's still alive so that I can just go right down to it. And I just leave the yellow as frozen. Just, I use colors a lot. So if you ever see one of my spreadsheets, you kind of go, oh my God. But so basically what we've got for these 24 districts reporting, if we just jump down to that red line that says initial education spending, it's just over $426 million. And that represents almost a 9% increase over those same districts from FY23 to FY22. They were in FY23, they were spending 391 is what they actually ended up spending. So we're up almost 9% from that. Again, my estimate for the December 1 letter was based on 8.52%. So we'll see what happens. Although this year I got one of the big districts in that I don't usually get till the end of May. That would be Essex Westford, because usually they vote late. So usually I don't see their numbers until much later on, but this time they sent me in information, so they're included here. I don't have Burlington. I don't have South Burlington, I don't think. So we're still missing some of the larger districts. But in terms of equalized pupils, which is the line right down below that red initial ed spending line, we have about 25% of the equalized pupils. So these 24 school districts represent about 25% of the equalized pupils. So that's kind of the numbers that we're looking at as we're rolling forward here. And then over there in the other columns, just this is what happened in the prior years, just so you have it as comparison. That's kind of what the sheet is. So their total budget is that expenditure line, that's budgets plus any debt deficit plus any other obligations they have, like to a regional technical center school district, is that first line. That's $518 million. That's up about 6%. But their offsetting revenues, which are the numbers that they're backing out when we're calculating education spending, are down about close to 6%, 5.7% from the prior year. So that kind of goes in the wrong direction too. But it's about $92 million, and that gets us the education spending line. And then the number that drives people's tax rate is the education spending per equalized pupil. And again, based on what we have, if it was just these 24 districts in the state, excuse me, education spending per pupil would be just over $19,900 per equalized pupil. And again, that's starting to get down to the weeds, and just a number thrown out there for comparison purposes. So what will happen is I will go back, talk to business managers. I'm meeting with them on Friday. I'll send them an email too saying, okay, I know most of you have board approved budgets, so please send them in. And so we'll have quite a few more at this time next week. I think we're at this time next week too, if I recall correctly. Sorcerer will tell me. And so basically we'll have a, I'm sure we'll at least double this, probably more than that. And we'll see.
The amount of districts.
Double the amount of districts.
Not double the money you're talking about.
The amount of districts. Hopefully it won't be doubling. We'll see what happens. But yes, we'll get a significant number of districts in there. And at some point, it will get to the point where I have enough information that the numbers aren't going to change significantly. Right now, there's still a big chance of them changing significantly in either direction. I don't know which way it would go, but frankly, I don't anticipate it getting that much higher. But
was ESSER money included in the offsetting revenues?
Well, yes, it was, but also the expenses were too, because when they had the expenses and those offsetting dollars, so they kind of just wash. They don't impact education spending, but yes, they were included because they knew about them last year and this year and the year before. That very first year they didn't know about them. So FY20, I guess that was.
Yeah.
So what is the drop in the offsetting revenues, the 5%? Why? Is there a reason for that?
I don't know without talking to them because right now I'm not seeing any detail whatsoever. Basically, I'm seeing 5 numbers. I'm seeing their total expenditures and I'm seeing their offsetting revenues. When we collect the actual budget, that'll have more information. But right now, I don't know. It's a question I'll have to ask them. It could be that a lot of people use surpluses because a lot of surpluses were built up last year over the course of the ESSER monies. So it could be that they used a lot of their surplus last year that they're not using this year. But I don't know. That's a question that I'll have to ask them.
But there's nothing going on state-wise that would, have we cut back programs that would have generated offsetting revenues?
Well, I take that back. Yes, we have. Special education. Basically, this is the first year we switched to the census block grant. Prior to this, we've always been a reimbursement model. When we were building the budget and doing all this work and going to the appropriations bill, what we're looking at is what they thought their expenditures were going to be. They would tell us. And we would say, okay, we're going to give you back, to make it up a number close to 56%. And that's the number that we would kind of use. And they would use some figure like that as an offsetting revenue. But when all was said and done, usually what happened is over the course of the year was when final numbers came in, their expenditures were not so large. And so we had always needed for them. And so they weren't using all even though reported. But with the census block grant, we're down, I'd say $25 million in terms of what we're putting out to people, in terms of what they were expecting for reimbursement. So that's probably a part of that. And I completely forgot about that. So I'm glad you brought that up. Okay.
Could you review for us again, or for me, the bottom 2 numbers there, the 21,500 and the 19,900? I don't understand the difference between the two.
So the first one is my abbreviation for equalized pupils. I do have enough room. I could type that out. But it's basically what that is, that 21,400 kids are equalized pupils. That's how many are in these 24 districts that are reporting.
Okay.
Okay. And so I'm saying it's about 25% of the total equalized pupil count for this year. Just so we have some semblance or some sense of what percent of the kids we're talking about here, because kids are kind of driving a lot of this.
So we've had this equation game played with the numbers. So these aren't real children. These are.
These are equalized pupils, right.
Got it.
And again, for those who aren't familiar with it, just very briefly, we're in the last year of equalized pupils. Equalized pupils are a 2-year average of what's called an average daily membership, ADM. And then state place students get added to that, and then those get weighted, and then they get normalized because there are too many kids in the state. And that's what equalized pupil is. And that's the part where everybody gets lost, isn't that last statement. What we're going to is, with the new weighting system, we're going to have more weights, different weights, but we're going to stop before we do the equalization. We're just going to have a long-term weighted ADM count. That's what will be happening. So it'll be a 2-year average still. But yes, that's basically what that 21,400 is. That's the equalized pupil count for those districts. It's gone through the current weighting factors and the equalization piece. And then that is just getting divided into what their education spending is, that $426 million. And that gives you the 19,900. Which is the education spending per equalized pupil, because it's all in my head. It's not on paper.
It's divided by 19,000?
No, it's the 426 million, the red number, divided by the 21,400.
Okay.
And that gives you the 19,900.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. Again, this is like falling off a log for me, so I don't really think about what it looks like to other people. And I should.
They will miss you when you leave.
I'll be around. I'll answer questions still.
Beth, did you?
Brad answered my question.
Oh, okay, great. And if it's helpful, I feel like we did a review of the weighting and like in sort of early days when maybe there was too much information. So if folks want another update on that later in the session, we can do that. Because we messed with a lot of stuff. And it's gonna have some pretty big impacts.
That's some pretty big impacts. And that's one of the things that's on my list to do, is to take the FY24, the numbers that I use for FY24 equalized pupils, and then apply the weights to those for FY25, the FY25 weights, so that people have an idea of, well, here's what our real count is, our equalized pupil count for FY24. Here's what it would be under Act 127 this current year. I did that for FY23 for them also, so people knew.
I've gotten some requests for that, so I appreciate that you're planning on doing that. I will hold you to it. Thank you.
Please do, because it'll make me ask for the information I need.
Anyone else? Yeah.
I want to make sure I understand the special ed change.
Mm-hmm.
Previously, when I was on the school board, we were developing budgets. The business manager would look at the special education coordinator and say, how much money are you going to need? Or how much money is going to, he didn't know, he just asked for a number and she says 7 million or something. So now instead he would ask the state what the grant is going to be.
More so, yes. I mean, if nothing else changed, they'd still need the same amount of money, because they still have the same student population with the same needs. Again, nothing else changing between the two systems. The question of what's changing is how much is coming from the state as special education aid, for lack of a better term. And so what it used to be depending on what you spent, you got a certain percentage of it, plus a couple other pieces in there. And now what's going to happen is now we're transitioning to a census block grant that will be uniform for everyone in FY27. And it's basically was based on what the state appropriated for 3 fiscal years. They got the better of 2 choices. And then it's divided by an average ADM count for the supervisory, because we're at the supervisory level now in terms of special education. So some people are high, some people are low right now because of the differences that we have. And so, but everybody's now transitioning towards that uniform rate that will hit in FY24. So they do know what they're going to be getting. Unless something changes and with inflation and such, they do know what they're going to be getting for the next 2 years, roughly, in terms of that. So it's not really a question of what your special education costs are anymore. Those are in your whole budget.
Right.
It's really what your offsetting revenues are that are coming in.
Okay,
It's more a fixed number at this point.
okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Look forward to seeing you more regularly as one of them. Are most budgets warned at this point?
Yes. There's
There's no like magical portal so that you would just easily have it.
no, those are hard. Those are painful. would be my answer to that. But no, most are warned. Usually after town meeting, they're forgetting anybody who may or may not fail. They're usually 20 to 25 that get voted after the regular town meeting day. So
Thank you.
you're welcome. It's nice seeing everybody. And congratulations.
Thank you.
Julia, hello. Welcome to committee.
Thank you. Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. Madam Chair, did you want to say a few words before I dive in?
I would love if you could sort of thank you, I will. So essentially, we're going to keep on doing this exercise where Brad's going to talk to us about whatever new numbers he has. We're going to look at the outlook, sort of adjusted for whatever new numbers he has, and slowly come towards a decision in the next month. And so Julia has built out this outlook in sort of two versions, one that includes the sort of additional asks on the Ed Fund this year, and one that doesn't. And she'll talk us through that, but it's a way of sort of understanding the impact on tax rates if we make different decisions for the yield bill, which will make more sense when Julia's talking us through the actual document than me talking about it right now. So over to you, Julia.
Thank you. So there is a document under my name on the committee page for the Ed Fund Outlook. And as Chair Kornheiser just referenced, you'll see that there's two FY24 columns on here reflecting different potential appropriations and sources changes within the education fund. And before getting into the details of the numbers, I do want to note that this really is this first step and that this is an ongoing process that will get more updated data as time goes on, and there may be new bills or new asks that are introduced into the education fund that the committee wants me to include in the modeling. So this is really just a first step in that.
And can I actually, to add to that, we're going to vote out the yield bill without perfect information though. That's what we do every year because there are school budget votes that happen after the date that we're going to be needing to make these decisions.
Yes. So because this starts in your committee, we're working with the best data that we have. But of course, as the process moves on and school budgets get voted and more decisions are made, there will be updates after this moves to the Senate. So it's just something to keep in mind that these numbers aren't final, but are really supposed to serve as a way for you to sort of structure your thinking around the yield bill and associated policy decisions. So just before we get into the numbers, we've got just to remind the committee, we've got in the far left column, this is just our different lines that we're looking at. Then we've got FY 2023 projected. This includes the technical BAA edits for FY 2023. And then as the chair mentioned, we have two FY 24 columns. Going to walk through the middle column, the FY 2024, including GovRec categorical aid proposals first. And this is really just referencing the appropriations that were included in the Gov Rec budget that are really just growing forward some of those appropriations. So this has been solved. The yield model has been solved, assuming that all dollars that would fall to the bottom line, so unreserved and unallocated dollars, all of those have been applied to uniformly lowering the average tax bill across all three categories. So the homestead tax rates, the non-homestead, and then the income rates. So included in this, so I mentioned that this is really just reflecting those updated appropriations that we're seeing in lines 10 through 23. I do want to note that line 10, the education payment, that was really what Brad was just speaking to in large part. And this doesn't reflect the updates that Brad was walking through today because they are still very preliminary. So this is still reflecting that education payment estimate from the December 1st letter. So all of these, and feel free to jump in and interrupt me if you have any questions as I'm going through. But I'm going back up to these summary lines, which is what we're often looking at when looking at the Ed Fund outlook. So lines A through I. What we see here is we see the solved yields and the uniform non-homestead property tax rate after taking into account these assumptions. And including applying all dollars on the bottom line to lowering the rates. So we see in line C, the uniform non-homestead rate would be $1.344. The property yield would be $15,975, and the income yield would be $18,229. And I did include a new line here for the purposes of the committee's analysis, which is line F, the average percentage bill change compared to the prior year. We see that on average with these assumptions, that the bill change across all three categories, the average bill change would be increasing by 0.54%. And we can interpret this by understanding that while we're seeing decreases in the average tax rate, we remember what we've been hearing about the increases in the grand list values. So just because there's a lower rate, that doesn't mean that there's necessarily a lower tax liability. I will pause there. Are there any questions or would anyone like more detail on this column?
I think we're good.
Okay. So then moving on to the far right column, FY 2024, including all GovRec proposals and universal school meals. This was requested to show some of the potential pressures on the education fund. So we have two GovRec proposals that I've included here. One is withholding for the tax computer modernization fund. And that would decrease revenues by approximately 1.1 million, according to the administration. And so that's in line 8A. So that will decrease the total sources by a little bit over $1 million. And then we also have included in the GovRec line 22 in appropriations, the Community High School of Vermont appropriation of 3.7 million. I've also included universal school meals. You'll recall that this was a one-year program, but a recent bill was introduced for universal school meals in Vermont. And I know we will be talking about this in my next testimony, but I do want to note that this 29 million is a placeholder. We're still waiting on some updated data from AOE to further refine that number. But it is in the ballpark of our estimated costs for FY24 if the General Assembly were to decide to move forward with the program in the structure it has currently. So including these 3 new lines and using all of the money on the bottom line to lowering tax rates, we can see in those summary lines again how the rates and the yields would be different than that earlier column we walked through. So looking at line C, we see that in this scenario, that the uniform non-homestead property tax rate would be $1.376. The property yield would be $15,599, and the income yield would be $17,747. And we can see in line F how that average bill change across all 3 categories would be increased by 2.94%. So I will pause there. I don't know if there's any questions.
Yes. Representative Sims.
So for that universal school meals line, that's just sort of a placeholder based on previous year. And do we have a sense of when we might have a more updated number for this year? Or do we expect that to be?
Yeah, so we estimated last year that it was going to be approximately 29 million. It's coming in right now as being a bit over 27 million if everything were to stay the same as it was in October. So that's for FY23. For FY24, we've updated our universal meals. I've updated the universal meals model to reflect the new data that we have from AOE. And I will touch on this in the next testimony, but we're estimating right now a range for FY24, if the program were to be the same as it is in the current year, a range of 26 to 31 million. So it's still the same cost area, or somewhere around 30 million. We're waiting on the updated data to refine that further. We will work to refine the estimate as the bill moves forward, if it moves into a money committee, and we'll start working on a fiscal note for that.
And then this modeling assumes all the same sources of revenue for the coming year.
That's correct. So if you recall from when we were first looking at, how to interpret the education fund outlook, we have those non-property revenue sources. So sales and use, a portion of the purchase and use, meals and rooms tax, lottery transfer, that's coming from the economist's consensus forecast. And we're assuming those as quote unquote givens for FY24. So we're using those numbers and then figuring out, okay, with the level of appropriations that are going to be expended out of the education fund and the non-property revenue sources coming in, what is that difference that needs to be made up with property tax dollars? And that comes into the solving that you're looking at here.
Thank you.
Julia, you have sort of a shorthand that's, I think, helpful to sort of understand what spending differences equate to changes in tax rates. I wonder if you could share that with us.
Sure. Yeah. So it's a rough ballpark idea, but when we think about costs coming in or expenses moving in or out of the education fund, roughly $10 million is going to be an additional penny on both the homestead and non-homestead rate. So same if there were to be a $10 million appropriation taken out of the education fund, all else equal, that would equate to about a penny less on both the homestead and non-homestead rate.
And that's, not for doing deep math, but I think it's helpful for getting a sense of scale when looking at some of these numbers. I think we're all studying it carefully rather than asking questions for a minute. Yeah.
Well, so it's been a while since I've really studied one of these sheets, and I'm wondering, what each of these things includes. And for food, if we're talking about a cost per meal, do we know what we're buying? Are we buying all food fresh from the farm? Or are we buying it out of the Grand Union? Or what are we doing? Are we,
So,
Can I jump in for a second, Julia? So we're gonna switch over our testimony to talk explicitly about school meals and revenue for school meals in like 1 minute.
that would be helpful.
Great.
I mean, what
Yes,
do
no,
you
I think
want
it's,
to do, Madam
yeah,
Chair?
I think it will be helpful. Let's just try to
Okay,
tie a tiny bow on this
okay,
very open-ended question and then switch over to that. Because we have a whole report that answers your question.
okay. No problem.
Anyone have anything on this outlook? Again, we're going to be using it every week, so yeah.
Julia, maybe I missed it, but on line 10 here, the education payment, are you using the number from the December 1 letter, or are you using the updated number that Brad was kind of working off of today?
yeah, thank you. So I'm using the education payment reflects the latest ask in the GovRec budget. So it's a little bit adjusted, but it practically reflects what we were looking at in the December 1st letter. It doesn't reflect the numbers that Brad was just walking through.
Okay, thank you.
I have another question.
Yeah.
When did we start putting the pension in here? The teacher's pension? That's new, relatively new, within 4 years.
I will have to go back and check. I don't want to speak off the cuff about that,
Okay,
but I will get back to you.
okay.
Yes.
And the same thing with the teachers, cost of the teachers, I forgot OPEB. It's a Stephanie thing. Whatever that is too. The pension and the OPEB, I think it's cost of healthcare after retirement.
Pre-funded, yeah.
Yeah, so OPEB stands for Other Post-Employment Benefits.
Yeah.
And that is a new line item in the education fund starting last year in FY20, or rather this year in FY 2023.
So I always thought this stuff ought to come out of the ed fund itself. So I'm glad to see it here. I just want to know when it started and what it includes.
Yeah, I
Thanks.
can definitely get back to you about that.
Okay, thank you.
And we could also have Chris come in and give Chris Roop from JFO come in and give sort of a broader update on pension changes in the last few years, if that's helpful.
I don't know him, but so Stephanie used to do that stuff, but she doesn't anymore.
No, Chris Roop sort of assisted us through all the changes we made last year. And he's sort of the person at JFO that's carrying that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question. Julia, I'm just looking at the numbers on line 9 and line 23. Can you just tell me why they don't match and what I'm missing here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the line 9, that's referring to the total sources. So that's summing up lines 1A through 8A.
Yeah.
And lines 23, that's summing up 10 through 22. That's the total appropriations. They don't match because there have been unreserved and unallocated dollars from the prior year that are being used to lowering tax rates. So because there are those additional dollars being applied, we don't see as much money being raised by the property taxes than we would see if both of those lines were to perfectly match.
Then does that mean that line 27 should be the difference between those, or is that not quite right?
Yes. So I can certainly walk you through. We've got the difference is in, you're seeing in, I'm just pulling up a detailed copy of my model. So we've got in line 23, revenue surplus and deficit. That's showing you the difference between those two lines.
Okay. 23 and 9, right?
Exactly.
Okay, great.
And
Thank
then line.
You have 2 lines 23.
You do.
Oh, do I? Okay. Yep, sorry about that. That was
It's
when
okay.
I
You mean the
updated my
second
numbers.
line 23, 23B.
Yeah, so,
Okay.
okay, so 23 under allocation of revenue and surplus, that is telling you the difference between the appropriations and the sources. And then line 27, transfer to from unreserved unallocated. That's looking at that revenue surplus or deficit that we're seeing there.
Okay.
And then taking out prior year reversions, the transfer to the stabilization reserve, and then if there were to be a transfer to the additional reserve. And then that's what's going down to the bottom line.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Julia. I think we can switch gears if you want to like drink some water. And talk about the possible revenue sources for school meals. And we can pull up that other document. This is a funny transition somehow. So we're going to dive really deep into one line item right now, everyone. And I'm going to give the floor back to you. Pat is here. I don't know what you feel.
She's starting.
Okay, great.
Great. Thank you. For the record, Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. There's a presentation under our names on the committee page, and that's really what we're going to be talking off of today. This slide deck has been put together to reflect the report that we published on February 1st regarding possible revenue sources for universal school meals in Vermont. I did allude to this in previous testimony when talking about universal school meals, but I just want to remind the committee that this was a report that was required in Act 151, the Universal Meals Bill, for us to look at possible revenue sources. So this is in response to that legislative charge. And I do want to start off with a big caveat that these aren't recommendations from the Joint Fiscal Office, but really just meant to provide some options in response to that legislative charge. So I'm going to kick things off by just reviewing the Universal Meals Program and how it fits into the Education Fund. And then I'll pass it off to my colleague, Pat, to talk about the revenue estimates. So I'm on slide 3, and we did talk about this in my testimony last week, but I just want to remind the committee that there's those primary cost factors of a statewide universal meals program. And those are the overall student participation rate. So how many kids are eating meals? Higher participation rate leads to higher costs. There's the percent of participating students who are eligible for federal free and reduced price meals. And the more students that are eligible for those federal meal programs, thus draw more federal funding down to the state to support meals and lower the state cost. And lastly, it's the difference between federal school meal reimbursement rates and the actual per meal costs. Moving on to slide 4, this is really, I know that the committee is well aware, I know we were just talking about this in the Ed Fund Outlook, but just a reminder of the revenue sources that are going into the Education Fund. We've got the non-property sources, the sales and use, a portion of purchase and use, meals and rooms, profits from the state lotteries, Medicaid reimbursement funds, and other miscellaneous sources. And then we've got the property tax of homestead and non-homestead. And so moving on to slide 5, I did just mention this when talking about the estimated costs, but we've updated our cost estimate based on the data that was collected by the Agency of Education thus far. And we're estimating that if it were to continue in its same structure as it was established in Act 151 for the 1-year program, that it would cost between $26 million and $31 million. And I've included a table here just to show how where the assumptions changed to create that range. So essentially we're looking at, okay, what did it look like in October 2022, which was the first month of the Universal Meals Program, and what are a couple of different things that could change based on the Agency of Education's report and collected data. So, there could be a slight increase in participation. If so, that would increase costs. And it could also be that there's the Medicaid pilot for enrolling students in the free and reduced price meal programs that Vermont is due to start this July. So we're expecting, or the Agency of Education is expecting, that the eligibility rate is probably going to increase. And so we're looking at potential increase in the percentage of students who are able to draw down more federal funds. So we've got that range of 26 to 31 million for FY 2024. Yeah, and feel free to jump in if you have any questions. I'm not as able to see the committee, so feel free to interrupt me.
I think we're following along. Thank you.
Okay, and so then just my last slide here. I'm on slide 6. As I know the committee is aware, property taxes are adjusted to ensure that all education expenditures are fully funded. So if there were to be no adjustment to non-property tax revenue sources, then any additional costs to the education fund would be funded through property tax revenues. So kind of using that benchmark in mind that we were just talking about, $10 million, roughly being about a penny on both the homestead and non-homestead rate, all else equal, we would estimate that fully funding the Universal Meals Program as it's currently established through property taxes would be approximately 3 cents increase on both the homestead property tax rate and the non-homestead property tax rate. So that wraps up my prepared remarks about our report, and I would pass it over to Pat unless there's any questions for anything I've talked about thus far.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Good to see everyone. I feel like Julia's looking over my shoulder now.
She turned off her screen so she can't see you anymore. That's not actually how it works. That's how it feels.
Looking at me through that one, right? All right, so Patrick Tierton, Joint Fiscal Office. The good news is we are going to be working off the same PowerPoint, so you don't need to pull anything else up. But we dive right into the sort of alternative funding mechanisms that you could pull, starting on slide 8. And this is just a little background of, why we picked to look at what we're looking at. So the idea was to look at potential revenue sources that are not ordinarily used for general fund purposes. And so everything you'll see in here is either an adjustment to something like the sales tax, which goes 100% there, or something totally new like a sugar sweetened beverages, which was actually the only option that was specifically laid out in the statute that we should be looking at. So what we included in the report, we've got the sugar sweetened beverages, like I mentioned, applying the sales tax to things like candy, pre-written software access remotely, which I know we've talked about in this committee already, and then some other adjustments either to the tax rate or the tax base, which again, that'll dive into, things like the tax expenditure report, which I know we've all talked about. If we jump right ahead, the first thing that we looked at was sugar sweetened beverages. And I know you all have looked at, you've had Rand come in here and talk about a similar estimate that they did, built on the Philadelphia model. We essentially use the same approach. Some of the past legislation has been, it's a similar type of tax. You're taxing the sugar sweetened beverages based on their volume. In the past, there have been proposals for a 1 cent or 2 cent per ounce tax. And so just like math, generally what that equates to is 12 cents per 12 ounce can or 24 cents per 12 ounce can, depending on what you have.
Can I ask you a question about that?
Yeah.
So my memory of the way we tax liquids is that sometimes it's like per product and sometimes it's per weight or gallonage, or can you sort of talk us? And I'm having like vague memories of a conversation around beer taxes last year that gallonage and all. Can you talk us through that a little?
Yeah, so there's a specific tax on malt beverages. There's one on Venus beverages, which are both based on so gallonage or volume. So that's measuring the tax that you're going to be placing on them by the volume of the liquid in there, not necessarily how many bottles you're talking about. And this is a similar type setup to those. This would be a type of excise tax. So you're taxing based on quantity or volume in this sense, and here the unit of measurement is just per ounce. So, if we're talking 1 cent, it's 12 cents for a can, 20 cents for a bottle. Once you get up to the 2 liter bottles, that's 40 ounces or something like that. Actually, might be more.
No. More.
So like 65 or something.
Is it 40?
Right.
Representative Odie.
Is there any thought anywhere that you've read about taxing by the amount of sugar in the beverage?
So we did look at other places that have, colloquially soda taxes. There aren't any other states that do it, but the municipalities that do it, everywhere else we've seen they're taxing on liquid volume. So we haven't seen any examples of taxing based on the sugar content.
And would you consider this a tax on sugar sweetened beverage or a repeal of an exemption of a sales tax?
So currently, these are not exempt from the sales tax.
Okay.
And I should double check that, but they don't fall under
They're not food.
They're not groceries, right? So no, you're not removing an existing one. And what's different about this is, so something like the sales tax, that's being paid by the consumer when they make that end point of purchase. Previous models of this tax are levied at the wholesale level. So when your gas station goes and buys to restock their Coke products or whatever, the tax is basically going to be baked into the price that they're paying to, build up their inventory.
Thanks. Yeah.
So can you give me the nexus? We've bounced sugar sweetened beverages from the schools. Yeah, we would like their money to help fund school meals.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess to start, it was the only tax idea that was listed in the bill language as something that we should look at. So I felt like unless we wanted to not do what you asked, we should better make sure we do it. But, I think it's kind of maybe a philosophical question that I don't know if I have a great answer for. But I suppose that's something to think about. And you will notice as we go on, there might not be a particular nexus between things like cloud software and school meals, but we're talking about, in that instance, the sales tax, which, sort of is viewed as sort of a simple way or more efficient way to, target something that's going directly into the education fund already. I guess as far as that goes, you'll see sugar sweetened beverages is the only kind of sort of novel or new tax we're talking about here. Everything else kind of centers around adjustments to, like additions to or adjustments to the sales tax. And just to refresh everyone's memories on what, what's kind of considered a sugar sweetened beverage. So it's defined as any non-alcoholic beverage, whether that's carbonated or not carbonated, and it's intended for human consumption, which seems obvious, but it's in the definition, and contains any added sweetener. And that also applies to things like powders and syrups that you'd mix with water.
I'm having flashbacks to the bottle bill floor debate, but like how easy or hard would it be for a retailer to kind of integrate into their POS software, sort of knowing what is a sugar sweetened beverage and what isn't?
Well, there's actually, if we kind of jump to the next slide, I have some examples of what you would consider, what you would include and what you would not include. So, the obvious ones are soft drinks, fruit drinks. Fruit drinks, though, is it has to have added sugar. If it's 100% natural fruit juice or vegetable juice, that would not be considered in this model that we're talking about here. So sports drinks, ready to drink teas and energy drinks. And then just below that is sort of how you'd be able to sort of delineate whether something should have that tax applied to it or not. Like I said, 100% natural juices, infant formulas, milk or milk alternatives, and then, your Diet Cokes, your Diet Nestle iced teas, things like that, and flavored water are some things that would not be included in this. But I guess in a way, it's sort of the same type of delineation retailers have to do now with figuring out what products in the store you need to have that applied to or not.
I think the way this one, retailers don't have to figure it out. The distributor figures it out.
Exactly.
It's an exercise.
Right.
Yeah. Different than sales tax.
Right. So if we are good, I provided on slide 12 some examples of other municipalities. There are currently no states, how other municipalities levy these kind of taxes, all kind of a similar model. So from the RAND report, you saw their estimate. They're based on Philadelphia, which is a 1.5 cent per ounce. I can't recall their number, but it's going to come in right in between ours. So it makes sense, right? Interestingly here, so Washington, D.C., they apply a sales tax to it, and it's different than their normal sales tax. So if you all remember, that means they are not participating in the streamlined agreement.
Thanks for that little quiz bit. Appreciate that.
And then also notably, there are a couple of examples where diet sweetened beverages, so it's, sweeteners, but non-caloric sweeteners are used. And that Philadelphia and Washington also include that in the base for their tax.
I've talked to a number of members of the healthcare committee who have been sort of variously interested in introducing a bill about this for public health reasons, less for revenue raising reasons. And I wondered if you had a chance to dive into any of that.
Well, if we're talking about
Sort of like a sin tax
Yeah.
perspective.
So I think actually one way to sort of illustrate how we're accounting for that a little bit is if we move to slide 13, I have sort of revenue estimates. And you can see that if you take 1 cent to 2 cents per ounce, you're doubling it, right? If you take my estimate for 1 cent, which is 17 million, and double that, that's less than the 31 or 32 million I'm showing for a 2 cent tax. And what we're accounting for in that is, sort of this concept of elasticity of demand. So as the price of something increases, you would expect people to maybe shift consumption habits and, in this case, reduce how much soda they're buying. So there is a treatment for it in that sense that, the more you tax something like this, and you see this with, other sin taxes, like with cigarettes, as they're taxed more and more, you do generally tend to see some decreases in consumption.
So in your estimate for 1 cent per ounce tax, the 17.3 is, have you figured the elasticity into that figure?
Yeah, so I guess I'll talk a little bit about how we came to the underlying numbers. So we didn't just look at the Philadelphia experience, and we were able to pull some data from what they've done for that. But there's this cool tool hosted by the University of Connecticut, their Rudd Center there, that they actually have an online calculator for what you could, like how many cents that you would apply to soda, and then what types of products you want to include and not include. So we use that as sort of another way to triangulate, and they have some assumptions built in for elasticity that helps you sort of understand that dynamic. Also included here, one benchmark we always like to do is look at the national market and sort of scale down to Vermont by population size. Another thing I like to do is pull from as many other states as we can, or in this case, towns or cities that we can get data for and triangulate that way. So also being sort of considered here is Berkeley, California, which we were able to find some information on there. So when you look at other states or other towns, actual data, implicitly you're going to sort of be capturing some of the, shift in consumer behavior because of they're doing this tax and this is what they're pulling in, right?
And this might be more a question for Rand than for you, so please feel free to. But I remember there was a part in their report where they said sort of none of these revenue options that they were discussing had a meaningful impact on someone's well-being or something like that. I don't remember the exact phrase. It was near the end of the report.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to work through what that means in the context of elasticity of demand that you're modeling. And I can ask them if you don't.
Well, I guess one question I might just ask for clarification is, are you talking doesn't harm sort of their household budget or their health?
I guess I don't know, and so maybe that's a question for Rand. I thought it was a really interesting phrase in the report.
Yeah.
No.
I'm not sure.
Okay, we will ask these questions.
One thing I will note about the RAND report, so they have it presented as like a 15% sugar sweetened beverage tax. And that 15% is actually coming from an example they have in the report. So it's really 1.5 cents, but they're using an example of a 20-ounce bottle that's costs $2. And sort of the math there comes out to 15%. So it's really what their model is showing what a 1.5 cents per ounce would raise. So if we're good with beverages.
1.5 cents.
Per ounce.
Okay.
So we're at the 1 and 2 cent per ounce. Right there in the, yeah.
Yep, and I'm just looking at it in the context of slide 12. Thanks.
Candy? This is an aside, but I noticed that you somehow have only pink Starburst in your candy bowl over there.
It's a really exciting post-Valentine's, pre-Valentine's. And are we next week as well? It's a very exciting pre-Valentine's Day special at that source out at the store.
Feel free to help us finish them off.
They stick to my teeth.
Any visitors in the committee room are welcome to the pink and red Starburst.
Just don't give us a pink tax on it.
Very good revenue joke there. You belong. Okay, sorry.
All right, well, I guess keeping on the subject of sugar. So we're moving on to slide 15 here. And, one thing that's been talked about in the past, this is my second year, so I don't know how long it's been talked about, but it's been talked about in the past, is applying the sales tax to candy. Currently, candy is considered a grocery, or it's treated as a grocery, and groceries are exempt from the sales and use tax. There are a bunch of states that also exempt groceries, but don't treat candy as a grocery, and it's taxed that way. There are other states that don't exempt groceries, and candy is considered a grocery, and it's taxed that way. And then just the third sort of more interesting option, and you can tell that these aren't streamlined states, but some states tax groceries at a lower rate. And candy's taxed through that avenue. So in our context, if we were to not treat candy as a grocery and to pull it out, treat it as its own thing, our estimate is that it would be about $3.7 million in revenue in fiscal year 24. One thing I want to note about this estimate and every other estimate you'll see is these are full year estimates. When new sales tax estimates are implemented, typically, unless otherwise specified, they take effect starting July 1st, which means that you are only going to be getting 11 out of the 12 months in that revenue from that source in the first year. So it starts in July. Retailers remit their taxes the 25th of the following month, unless they earn a lower amount and don't do it in, like, quarterly or something like that. So overall, a little over, so 27 states and Washington DC apply the sales and use tax to candy. So we're talking the remainder either don't have any type of sales tax or are being like Vermont and exempting it either through the grocery tax or some other means. If you are all interested in what surrounding states have, I realize now it might have been interesting to put that on another slide, but there is a table in the Universal Meals Report which shows you how every state does treat candy. And you'll see there all the sort of interesting different combinations like I was walking through earlier. So any questions on candy?
I want to warn the committee that if we go deeper into the candy conversation and someone brings up their struggles with flour not being included, I'm just gonna make you be on the Streamlined Sales Tax Association. So go negotiate it there rather than in this room. I just want to put that on the table today. Because that's where that fight can be had, if that's a fight you want to have. Yes.
I have no problem. We'll figure it out. I've had issues before with sugar sweetened beverages, so-called. And they're out there, so I might just say what they are for people who hadn't heard them before. One is the fact that it's an excise tax means that the mom and pops have to carry the burden and the huge stores don't. Excise taxes, because they're applied at the wholesale level, can be spread throughout the store. Walmart, thousands of products. Little mom and pop, where they may rely on soda, can't hide it anywhere. I mean, it's part of their bottom line. And so it'll affect the mom and pop's small grocery stores more than it will Costco. And it troubles me. It doesn't mean I'm a dead set no at this point in time, although as I've said before, I don't think it would change obesity rates, because there's plenty of other ways to get overweight, tons of other ways. But anyway, so I'm just, those have been my objections in the past, and I thought I'd just let people know why I get cranky considering this, but maybe we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
You didn't mention the border.
And the border.
That's
Yeah.
I'm teasing.
Towns I represent, and I work a 4-hour shift every Monday morning at Danowitz, if you don't have it, you don't need it,
I agree with that.
It's a genuine, small, community asset grocery store, and Danowitz is competing with everything in West Lebanon, and why give them one more excuse to go to Shaw's or those places over there to buy your soda. And as you know from flyers in the Sunday paper, they practically give away soda sometimes of the year just as a boss leader bring people in. So particularly when there's a Super Bowl coming up or something like that. Mm-hmm. So anyway.
I had not thought about the difference between the sugar and the sugar substitute being, I just thought it was all maybe treated the same way. So I wonder if we would be shifting consumer behavior away from real sugar to a substitute. That is a concern that I have. Another thing is, if it's on the ounces, well, the positive of that is if the containers get smaller, then it's less that gets shipped. It's less carbon impact to the smaller bottles if they put more sugar in the bottles or more artificial sweeteners in the bottles. So that's a positive for the environment, I think. And then, my third thing that I was thinking about. No, those are the two things that I'm just wondering about.
I generally feel concerned about taxing sort of grocery type items as a behavior change mechanism. I think it tends to punish poor people in a way that I'm not generally interested in doing with tax law. I think we're always sort of weighing the good of what we're spending the money on with where we're raising it from. And so it's not a never say never, it's just sort of an ongoing concern I have around sugar taxes. Because I think they're often described in the public as sort of like a blunt force instrument to get people to consume less sugar because it's bad and people shouldn't do bad things. And I don't feel quite comfortable with that narrative. But cloud tax, on the other hand, is a whole other conversation.
Yeah, we can move ahead to cloud tax, and a lot of this is going to be very redundant for you all, so bear with me for a second.
And I'm sorry we had you all in for all these pieces before you finished the report.
We hadn't told you what was in the report yet. So just background, which you all know, pre-written software accessed remotely has not been subject to the sales and use tax via session law from 2015. Generally, a sales tax applies to tangible personal property. And, you know, because of the sort of connection with services that these products have, and services generally are not subject to the sales tax in Vermont, you know, it sort of has been the basis or reason for why it's not been applied in the past. Although, as we've talked about, you've all seen that, you know, you don't really go to the store and buy a CD to load into your computer anymore. So this is just very much sort of the way that software is accessed for the most part these days. And so, you know, three things we looked at. I'm on slide 19. I know I'm skipping ahead a little bit. We looked at software as a service, platform as a service, and infrastructure as a service. You know, examples of those, again, moving ahead a little bit, are on slide 20. And so these are the types of products that would be subject to the tax. You know, one important distinction here is that this doesn't cover any, you know, fully custom made software. That's an important distinction with it being pre-written. And, you know, the number on slide 21 is the same number I've been in here in the past and showed you. It's increased just from last year. I'm on slide 21.
Representative Odie, Representative Sims.
Oh, wait. When you said it does not include fully customized.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, what does not include it? Which particular category? What we're talking about, period?
What we're talking about, period, I guess, because the emphasis here is on pre-written or canned software that you're accessing remotely. It's being, you know, the service is being hosted by a vendor rather than being downloaded onto your computer. And another, you know, carve out there is this idea of fully custom software. So maybe it's helpful to kind of lay out an example here. Let's say you are a online retailer and you want to handle your payment systems a little differently. So you want to contract out with a developer to create this novel or bespoke software to handle payments for you. You know, something that hasn't been created before and is very specific to your type of business. That's an example where the purchase price of the software would not be taxable. And any ongoing maintenance services of that bespoke software would not be taxable. Part of the reason or justification behind that is that you're kind of getting into a realm of where you might be double taxing if you're taxing custom software, because at the end of the day, you need software to make software. So the contractor developer that you're working with is probably going out and paying taxes on whatever services they're using as they're developing your software.
Even but that has nothing to do with the cloud. That software to create software is just,
Well, that would also be, they would likely, when doing that, have to be using another type of pre-written software that they're accessing remotely.
But that could also be considered, I mean, there's some universe where maybe that would even be considered a manufacturing input or a whole, were you about to say that?
Well, it costs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the cost of doing business.
Right.
Representative Sims, Canfield.
So I'm assuming, because you only mentioned on this slide about the growth in this market, that you see the two other previous options as pretty stable revenue sources, but maybe what's different about this one is, I mean, I know you can't predict the future, but you've seen a lot of growth. It sounds like you expect that we might see continued growth in this market over time.
I mean, so generally speaking, the sales and use tax is a fairly sort of consistent tax. You know, it's a very broad base. So you would have to see somewhat large changes in the, general changes in the population of how people are consuming certain types of products. I think one of the reasons it is it's 100% dedicated to the education fund is because it is somewhat consistent, much more so than other tax types like corporate or personal income, which can be quite volatile. Or maybe volatility isn't the right word, but they can change quite a bit from year to year. So getting back to your question, sugar sweetened beverages, candy, those are sort of long established standing markets where we have seen, sort of what consumer behavior is like over a long period of time. Something like this type of software, it's just every time we go to update this estimate, the market has grown quite a bit. I'm sure I could make a bunch of money investing if I could predict how much it's going to grow going forward, but I don't see any reason right now to suspect that it's going to slow down in the near term. I'm sure it will at some point as the proliferates, that's a hard word, the market more, but I think just in 23 and 21, I think the estimate was around 11 or 13 million. Last year we're at 16. This year we're bumping up to 18. So it is a market that's growing quite a bit.
So where would this tax show up?
This would show up, sorry.
No, go ahead, I'm sorry.
This would be a sales and use tax. You mean where?
Yeah, so on my internet bill or on my cell phone bill or where?
No, so this would be like if you go and you use TurboTax to do your taxes, at the end when you're sort of paying for that service, paying your taxes that way, it would show up as a line item. Like, if you went to the store and bought, I was going to say a new pair of shoes, but those are exempt. Some product that is taxed, you go and it's a line item on your receipt. So it's end consumer.
Let's go to sales tax rate.
Okay. So currently sales tax rate is 6%. And I've got a little chart or table here that shows you how that stacks up to states around in the neighborhood, basically. A very good point was just made earlier, I forget who it was, about the fact that Hampshire does not have a sales tax. So while you're looking at this and you see, okay, we're sort of in the middle of the pack, we're kind of on par with a lot of our peers, that kind of glosses over the fact that there is that long contiguous border that we have with New Hampshire where there is no sales tax.
And am I remembering right that New York has a huge number of sort of county level and local sales taxes?
Are remembering right. So that is only their state sales tax. It doesn't account for the myriad of local taxes that they have, which sort of the average might be in one of those presentations that Emily Byrne presented, but I'll see if I can dig that up to see where they kind of fall when you put it all together. So again, we're talking about the sales tax. So just thinking about, what changes could we make to that? first up idea here is if we increase, and I'm on slide 24 now. If we increase the actual rate without making any other changes, what would you expect to happen? So according to the January 23 consensus forecasts, Tom and Jeff are expecting us to, or forecasting us to raise about $576 million from the sales tax rate. That sort of implies a base, so taxable sales of around 9.1 billion, and which equates to, if we want to look at what incremental steps up would look like, for each 0.1% increase in the sales tax rate, you could expect, based on the forecast, to raise about 9.1 million. So 0.2%, you're looking at 18 million, so on and so forth. And so again, that's a full year estimate. That assumes that you're starting, I guess, essentially June 1st as opposed to July 1st, and you're getting all 12 months. And the sort of last thing that's included in the report is other expansions to the sales tax base. We've talked about, we talked about a lot of these. There's 38 of these in the tax expenditure report. We're estimating that in fiscal year 24, those expenditures will result in approximately 332 million in foregone revenue. But the caveat here is that 4 exemptions make up almost all of it. So it's groceries, medical products, energy purchases, residence, and then clothing and footwear. Those 4 make up 271 of the $332 million. But that means that there are still 34 other exemptions that we provided estimates for in that report. What's the difference there? About $60 million in foregone revenue every year. Just something that you can look at when you're thinking about, education fund dedicated exemptions that exist out there. And I guess if we move to slide 27, there's sort of a summary here of the different options that we looked at for this report. I know Julia mentioned earlier a few of the different other streams of income that go into the education fund. A couple examples being meals and rooms, purchase and use. We did think about those streams. The one difficulty with those is that they're not 100% dedicated to the education fund. So you get a little bit more complicated in there, in that you would then either have to start thinking about, how does this affect this other fund? Do we want the extra money going in this other fund? Do we want to then start messing around with the allocations? So changes to those 2 types are not included in this report, sort of, because you start asking a much more complicated question when you talk about those. But that's what I have in the report, and I'm happy to take more questions if there are some.
Did you do any research on if we included diet beverages in the sugar sweetened beverage, what the dollar amount would be?
I did not, but I would be happy to look at that. That sort of would be a bolt on to the model I already have, so that shouldn't be too difficult for me to do.
I would love to know what that number would look like.
Sure.
We're either going to go take a break, or Jim or Carol's going to ask a question. I'm really not sure which is going to happen right now.
I'm not sure how the revenue stacks up. If there's a considerable amount of money, for instance, in cloud, 18, whatever, growing. And we consider that as sales tax and put that in the education fund, which is what we've been doing for a decade or whatever, for good reason. Rather than split it up, part here, part there, I'd put it all in the education fund, and I'd take something else like maybe purchase and use tax, money and put that to like their charging stations or something for which there's a nexus. It's just a thought. I'd like to keep the lines distinct so we know what we're doing, not getting them all mixed up.
I don't understand the charging stations thing that you're
I think the
saying.
transportation fund has a huge revenue deficit right now, and so I think there's a lot of hunting for those purchase and use funds for other purposes over there.
Understood. But anyways, charging stations, EV charging stations, we need a bunch of them. We don't have money for them. Purchase and use tax on automobiles might be a good source. Close parentheses for now.
Yes, and then we're gonna take a break.
I don't want to say it out loud.
Then don't.
All right.
I was just teasing, you are.
No, but I know, I don't.
I'm gonna come up with a question.
I want to look like I'm trying to tax everything in the world, but I'm thinking of bottled beverages, period. And so if you don't want to change people's behavior, then did you look at a tax on any bottled beverage, all bottled beverages? I don't know how, see what I'm trying to say. I'm concerned if you tax sugared and then people go to diet, well then the representative said, well, what about, what it would look like if you put it on everything that's a soda? Well, how about anything that's canned or bottled or, did you look at that?
I think I'd like to respond by saying I would like to talk to Abby Shepherd. Because I know that it's not quite that simple. And then.
Not that I want to do this, I'm just.
Yeah, because you also be bringing in.
Any behavior.
You'd also be bringing in products like bottled water, which, is important for a lot of people. So.
It also, to sort of have a flashback to the bottle bill conversation, you bring in milk.
Yeah.
You would have some exclusions.
You bring in nutritional supplements.
You would have some exclusions based on true health.
Yeah.
Nutrition, but anything that's fun tax or something, I don't know.
Okay, we're going to take a break now, and we are going to come back at 2:45 to talk about